In Millbrook County, the first signs of Caleb Voss's unusual project emerged when residents spotted him loading a rotted beehive onto his father's flatbed truck. Most assumed he was hauling junk to the burn pile, and no one thought twice. Abandoned hive boxes littered behind half the barns in the valley, stacked and forgotten. Some were infested with wax moths, others collapsed from years of rain. Caleb had approached 3 different farms to take theirs off their hands, and each had agreed without hesitation. After all, who would want a pile of dead, rotting beehives? But when he asked a 4th and 5th farm, and by the time snow melted off Miller's Ridge that spring, the 17-year-old had collected over 40 abandoned hives, stacking them neatly behind the equipment shed like he was constructing something visible to the whole town, yet inexplicable. His mother questioned him once at dinner about the purpose of a shed full of dead bee boxes. He simply shrugged and said, "I'm still figuring it out." That wasn't an answer, but it was the only one he offered for a long time. If you enjoy stories about perseverance, rural innovation, and ordinary individuals achieving remarkable feats, subscribe and follow us weekly. And before we continue, share in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how these stories spread. Millbrook County was the kind of place where everyone's affairs became everyone else's business, whether they wanted it to or not. Nestled in a shallow valley 2 hours from the nearest interstate, it was ringed by dairy farms, hay fields, and a few orchards passed down through 3 or 4 generations. The Voss family managed 40 acres of mixed pasture and row crops, nothing elaborate, just a livelihood built on thrift and long hours rather than scale. Caleb grew up doing chores before school and after school. Like most kids in the valley, he wasn't remarkable. Quiet, observant, preferring to watch how things worked rather than speak about them. His grades were fine, his attendance fine. Nothing about him suggested ambition, at least not the kind adults recognized, which made it all the more surprising when he began asking questions about bees. It started small. A conversation at the feed store with old Harlan Petrie, who once kept hives decades earlier before arthritis robbed him of strength. Caleb's questions didn't sound idle. They probed ventilation, why a hive might die overnight, what it meant when bees stopped returning with pollen. Harlan, flattered that someone under 60 cared, talked for nearly an hour. Then Caleb began collecting. Each farm had its story about why the hives were abandoned. Old man Doyler's colonies had collapsed 2 winters prior, and he never found the heart to try again. The Ray's family had lost 3 hives to colony collapse disorder, a mysterious phenomenon where worker bees simply vanished, leaving behind a queen, some brood, and untouched honey, with no clear cause. Some hives suffered wood rot, others were torn open by raccoons seeking larvae. All were deemed worthless. One of the Ray's boxes proved sturdy enough to save, becoming one of the first hives Caleb revived, a testament to his belief that something could still be salvaged from what others dismissed as a loss. Caleb didn't think they were worthless, he just hadn't yet explained why. The town noticed the shed filling up before they registered what he was doing. His friend Dylan asked him bluntly one afternoon while fixing a fence, "You're not seriously trying to start a bee farm with garbage boxes, right?" "Working on it," Caleb replied. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now." Dylan let it go, sensing Caleb had already made up his mind and that further discussion wouldn't change it. What no one knew yet was that Caleb was chasing an idea he couldn't fully articulate, slowly taking shape in a battered spiral notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. Pages of sketches, measurements, notes copied from library books on apiculture, printouts from the county extension office, and a list of questions for the one man in the valley who might know the answers. That man was Walt Iverson, 74, a retired commercial beekeeper who'd once managed nearly 200 colonies before age and arthritis forced him to slow down. Walt lived alone on the town's edge in a house surrounded by lilacs and rusted equipment, and most valley kids feared him for his intolerance of nonsense. Caleb visited him one Saturday morning with his notebook and a question gnawing at him for weeks. Could a dead-out hive be revived using bees from a healthier colony? Walt studied him for a long moment before answering. "Depends what killed it," he said, motioning him to sit. That marked the beginning of something neither expected. Over the coming weeks, Walt became a blend of teacher and skeptical overseer, constantly challenging Caleb and withholding easy answers. He taught him to read a hive's health like a book if he knew what to look for. A tight, consistent brood pattern indicated a strong, well-mated queen, while a patchy, scattered pattern suggested trouble, perhaps a failing queen or disease. Most hive deaths, Walt explained, weren't mysteries. Neglect, poor ventilation in summer scorched colonies from within, inadequate insulation in winter left them starving before spring arrived. People would stack a super, walk away, and wonder why bees didn't survive. "Bees don't fail," Walt said one afternoon, holding up a frame from one of Caleb's salvaged boxes. "People fail bees." That lesson clung to Caleb long after. Not every lesson came easily. Caleb's first requeening attempt failed spectacularly. He introduced a new queen too quickly and the colony killed her within a day. Walt didn't sugarcoat it. "You rushed it," he said. "Bees don't care how excited you are. You cage her, let them get used to her scent over days, then release her gradually." Caleb rebuilt his approach around patience, a quality that didn't come naturally to a teenager eager to prove himself. He started small, converting 3 sturdiest salvaged hives into working colonies using bees from a nucleus supplier 2 counties over, small starter colonies with young mated queens and frames already drawn with comb. It wasn't glamorous. It was slow, deliberate work, patching rotted wood, replacing frames destroyed by wax moths, scorching interiors with a torch to sanitize them, a method Walt swore by for equipment with uncertain histories. By early summer, those first 3 hives were humming, literally. Caleb learned to read the sound of a healthy colony, a steady low hum that shifted pitch if something was amiss. He recognized swarm cells, those peanut-shaped structures bees build when preparing to split colonies, and understood that catching them early could mean the difference between retaining bees or watching them vanish into the woods. He also grasped nectar flow, the seasonal windows when flowering plants produced enough nectar for honey surplus, and began mapping the valley's prime forage: clover along the county road, wild blackberry thickets on the Petrie property, a stand of basswood trees nobody noticed, but bees adored. Slowly, without realizing it, Caleb was absorbing the entire valley ecosystem through the eyes of a creature most overlooked. News spread as it always does. Some gossip wasn't kind. Older farmers joked that the Voss kid had lost his mind meddling with bees when real chores awaited. His uncle half-seriously questioned his father about sending him to see someone. His father, commendably, said little and let him work. Yet not everyone dismissed him. Mrs. The Alders, who ran the elementary school garden club, began asking questions when she saw him hauling frames through town. Harlan Petrie started stopping by just to watch the hives, nodding approvingly at something unnamed. Even Dylan joined on weekends, pulling frames and enduring stings without complaint about the smoker's smell. The turning point came in late July during the valley's worst heat wave in a decade. Caleb's colonies, unlike several established operations, kept working straight through it. He'd built hive stands with extra ventilation gaps and painted boxes light colors to reflect heat, tricks Walt had learned through decades of trial and error. 2 neighboring beekeepers lost colonies to heat stress that week. Caleb lost none. That attention eclipsed any explanations. By late July, Caleb had split 2 of his strongest hives and added more rebuilds from salvage stock, surpassing a dozen working colonies. Growth like this stemmed from careful management as much as luck. A healthy hive outgrowing its space would often raise a new queen and divide naturally. Walt had shown him how to catch that moment and turn one crowded colony into 2 thriving ones instead of losing half to swarming. But summer wasn't done testing him. In early August, Caleb spotted trouble in one hive, a colony he'd especially prized, one of his first successes from nothing. The bees moved sluggishly, fewer ventured foragers returned with empty pollen baskets. When he pulled a frame, his stomach sank. Instead of a tight brood pattern, he found scattered, irregular cells, some capped and sunken rather than smooth and domed. He drove straight to Walt's, wrapping the frame in a damp towel. Walt examined it under a lamp for a long time before speaking. "Could be a few things," he said. "A failing queen running out of stored sperm, foul brood. And if it's foul brood, we're not saving this colony, we're burning it before it spreads to every hive you've got." Caleb's throat tightened. Weeks of work, perhaps destroyed by an invisible threat. They tested for foul brood first, a bacterial disease capable of wiping out an entire apiary. Using a simple field test Walt kept in his truck, it came back negative. The problem, they decided, was a queen nearing the end of her productive life, likely 2 or 3 years old, naturally slowing with age. "This is the part nobody tells you when they picture beekeeping," Walt said, snapping the test kit's lid shut. "It's not really about the bees most days. It's about noticing things early enough to still fix them." Caleb recued the hive that week, slow and careful, exactly as Walt had taught him from the start. Within 10 days, the brood pattern tightened, and the colony foraged like nothing had happened. A minor crisis in the grand scheme, but it taught him something deeper than any triumph. That a thriving hive wasn't a finished project. It required ongoing attention season after season, much like any living thing worth preserving. By August, Caleb had expanded to 15 working colonies, all rebuilt from equipment others considered trash. He harvested his first real honey crop that month, running frames through a borrowed extractor at Walt's. The two worked late into the evening as golden honey spun free and clung to the tank's bottom. It wasn't a fortune, just a few £100 sold at the farmer's market in hand-lettered mason jars. But it wasn't really about the honey, and everyone who spoke with Caleb that fall grasped that quickly. What he was building became clear only when local orchard owners asked a question nobody expected. Could his bees pollinate their trees next spring? 2 valley apple orchards had struggled with poor fruit set for years, suspected to link to declining wild pollinators. Caleb had sensed this early in his notebook's half-formed queries about why the old orchard faltered even in good weather. But he'd never been certain it would work until the orchard owners asked. Now he had his answer. He'd created a reliable local source of healthy pollinators, movable to orchards during bloom, then returned to pastures and forest edges for the rest of the year. It wasn't his original plan. It was better, sharpened by everything he'd learned. He hadn't set out merely to keep bees. He'd aimed to rebuild something the valley had quietly lost, a functioning pollination network using nothing but what others deemed waste. Winter brought its own quiet trial, one devoid of drama, just cold, patient waiting. Walt warned him more colonies die in winter than any other season, not from freezing but from starvation and moisture issues. Bees don't hibernate. They cluster tightly, vibrating flight muscles to generate heat, slowly consuming stored honey as weeks pass. A hive with insufficient honey or trapped condensation chilling the cluster could die quietly in February, unnoticed until too late. So in November, Caleb checked every colony one last time, weighing boxes by hand for honey reserves, adding insulation wraps, cutting upper entrances so moisture could escape rather than pool on inner covers. He installed mouse guards on every entrance, knowing a cold hive invited rodents seeking warm nesting spots. Then there was nothing to do but wait. He checked the hives every few weeks, brushing snow from entrances, pressing his ear close to listen for that low, steady hum signaling the cluster was alive and holding. Some days, silence frightened him more than any disease. But when March's first warm days arrived and he pried open the first box, he found the colony exactly as he'd left it, smaller, having endured a harsh season, but alive, with the queen already laying fresh eggs in a new ring at the frame's center. Every single hive survived. Walt, who'd lost colonies most winters despite careful efforts, admitted it was among the best survival rates he'd ever seen from a first-year operation. That same spring, as trees began budding, Caleb moved 8 of his strongest hives to the Dueler orchard for bloom season, the same farm that had abandoned beekeeping after its own colonies collapsed years earlier. Old man Dueler watched the delivery silently, arms crossed. He started visiting the Voss place occasionally that winter. Never lingering, just asking brief questions about hive survival before leaving. It was the closest thing to curiosity the old man showed. 6 weeks later, Dewler stood in his orchard amid branches heavy with young apples needing propping. He hadn't seen fruit set like this in over a decade. That afternoon, he drove to the Voss place, found Caleb repairing a hive stand, and stood there a long moment before speaking. "Didn't think much of what you were doing with those old boxes," he said. "I know," Caleb replied. "Wasn't sure you did either, honestly." Caleb almost laughed. "Wasn't always sure myself." Dewler nodded slowly, gazing at the shed full of hives that had once been destined for burn piles, and offered the closest thing to an apology a man like that would ever give. "Well, glad somebody in this valley was paying attention." The following year, Caleb managed nearly 30 colonies and secured pollination agreements with 3 local orchards for each spring's bloom. Harlan Petrie began visiting most weekends just to sit and chat bees, something he later admitted gave him more purpose than he'd felt in years. Walt Iverson, though, never stopped offering corrections, though they grew fewer and less frequent as seasons passed. The valley didn't transform overnight, but something in how people viewed neglected equipment shifted. A forgotten hive ceased being trash and became potential. A quiet, unremarkable teenager stopped being someone they worried about and became someone a few quietly began to admire. What Caleb built wasn't flashy, a business empire or overnight windfall. It was a modest, patient system of restored hives, healthy colonies, and improved harvests. Proof that most of what the valley had dismissed as worthless simply needed someone willing to look closer and ask why, rather than assume they already knew. He still kept that spiral notebook, now filled with 3 years of notes instead of a few sketches. And every spring, when orchards bloom and his bees' hum fills the valley air, a few more people recall exactly why they once doubted him, and why they no longer do. If you've ever kept bees, planted a pollinator garden, or worked a piece of land others gave up on, share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear it. And if you enjoyed this tale, subscribe for more stories of ordinary people building something extraordinary from what everyone else discarded.